We went over Peperomia Care tips in the last episode, but for those of you who are big plant nerds, I know you're curious to see what Peperomia I'm growing indoors. So I'll show you some of my collection and dive a bit more deeply into their characteristics. So over here to my left, just as a reminder, are the more succulent varieties of Peperomia. And as you work your way over to the right of me, it's going to be the less succulent varieties of Peperomia. So let's start here on the left. Some of the succulent varieties of Peperomia are some of my favorite. I am not necessarily growing them directly in southern or western windows here in the northern hemisphere. I have some that are kind of pulled a little bit way back because they don't necessarily grow in such strong light, as some of these are actually understory plants or growing on rocky crags. What I think is interesting of some of these varieties, so this is Peperomia ferreyrae, and there's Peperomia dolabriformis. Dolabriformis means axe-shaped, which actually refers to the leaves. And this Peperomia graveolens, and actually if you come over here, you'll be able to see this Peperomia that looks like Wolfgang cranii, but it's actually Peperomia silver spark. It's a different type of cultivar. But you'll notice that these leaves are kind of folded like hot dog buns. That's what it looks like to me. And what's interesting about this plant is that it's very succulent, and its leaves, that thickness is actually caused by the epidermal layers within the leaf. So typically when we think of a leaf, we think of a bifacial leaf. It has two sides, right? An upper side, which is called adaxial, and a lower side, which is called abaxial. And that's what we think when we think of a leaf. However, interestingly enough, these leaves are actually unifacial, so it only has one side. It doesn't have an upper or lower surface. It's actually just like a hot dog bun, kind of folded into itself. And the epidermis is actually this thin, long window. This is called Peperomia green beans, you know, funny enough, or long beans sometimes it's called. But there's this little darker green window that you could see in the ferreyrae and the dolabriformis, for instance, or even in the graveolens. What's interesting about that is that you usually see that window in some African species like Haworthia cooperi or lithops, and that usually brings in the light and then refracts it all certain ways into the plant, which means that it's trying to reduce or increase the amount of light in certain aspects of the leaf. And these are more South American species. I think actually most of these are from Peru or Chile or Bolivia or some of those areas. And so this is a strategy for it to actually not only retain the water, but also to direct the light into its leaves accordingly in these extreme conditions. Now, as you start to go a little less succulent, you see the upper and the lower surface of the leaves, but it's got these really actually hard, almost armored leaves and very thick, hard stems. In the case of this Kimnachii, or I believe this is Peperomia tetraphylla. It's never had a name, but I do believe that this is a tetraphylla. Or you might see Peperomia hope, which is a hybrid cultivar, which also has these really succulent penny-shaped leaves. And you have Peperomia incana, or Peperomia verticillata, which is called belly button peperomia, maybe because it's fuzzy, I'm not sure why. I don't know how many people have a fuzzy belly button, but these actually are another form of succulents where they either have a cuticle, like this shiny cuticle in obtusifolia, or they have this fuzzy nature. And that tells me that it's either, you know, reflecting light back, so it's probably in some kind of extreme light condition, and also protecting the water on the inside of the plant. So in this case, these are some fuzzier varieties of Peperomia, which you don't always often see. Now this one is a very common variety, Peperomia obtusifolia. There's also Peperomia clusia, which has a little bit more of a thinner, droopier leaves. This is the variegated version, and you also have one that has a red edge. You also have one that's really dark green. Very common to find in garden centers, and also again, very succulent stem, very succulent leaf, but also has this nice shiny cuticle. And as you kind of work your way over, you'll see in some cases it gets less and less shiny, but still has a very thin layer of cuticle. The interesting thing is you wipe off that cuticle or scrape off that cuticle and the plant will dry out very quickly. So even in some of these succulent varieties where it has like up to 80% of this epidermis, this little water storage unit in this leaf, if you wipe off that cuticle, a lot of that water will actually dissipate and disappear, and that plant will dry out very quickly. So that cuticle on the Peperomia leaf is so important in order to be able to keep the water in. And again, making it such a good house plant because you don't have to water it all that often. Now these plants have ridges, as you could see. This is Peperomia marmorata, which I think looks similar to Peperomia caperata, which you see these three different varieties here. This is Peperomia silver frost, Peperomia ruby, and Peperomia pearl, caperata pearl. And you'll notice these ridges on the leaf, these furrows. And I believe that this Peperomia probably deals with some dry conditions because of its succulence, but also probably deals with some really extreme wet conditions and has these furrows probably to lead the water off of its leaves and maybe into the environment around it. So if you ever tend to overwater Peperomia, you'll notice they'll rot pretty quickly. So this might be a way for the Peperomia to actually shed water away from its root systems, particularly if it's going through a heavy rain. One of my favorite varieties of Peperomia, Peperomia pereskifolia, which is starting to get a little less succulent but still has kind of that meaty stem. And you get into Peperomia elongata, Peperomia prostrata, which has these really beautiful round-shaped leaves and cascade over a hanging basket. Very beautiful hanging basket plant. And then you have some of my other favorites, which is Peperomia dahlstedii. I have a couple of these. Very vigorous plant that kind of cascades over. Quadrangularis, which I think has a stem that has like 4 edges similar to like a mint. Very good one to grow. I never overwater this one. I treat this very much like a succulent plant. This one is a common one, and I have 2 versions of it here. I have several of these growing in my home. This is Peperomia tetragona, and they usually sell it kind of straight up, but pretty soon after it starts to go a little bit more scandent to the ground and kind of crawls along on the ground. This is often called Peperomia pucciolata, but that's just a synonym for its scientific name, which is Peperomia tetragona. It's also called parallel Peperomia. I love the pinstripes on this. I do love that kind of like pinstripey watermelon look, which is also common in the argyreia, which you see here. And you could see also that that stripy look a little bit in the dahlstedii and the quadrangularis. This is Peperomia metallica. There's a few different variations of this. I found this to be an extremely resilient plant. This is actually and has been growing in my vertical swing garden for years now, and you could see that it's starting to get a little bit more robust and it's putting some new stems out there. This one is a sad looking Peperomia. This was sad when I got it. I got this as a cutting from a botanic garden. This is maypurensis. It's a little fuzzy on the outside of its leaves, and it looks really chlorotic to me. It was chlorotic when I got it, and I have not been able to get it past the sad looking stage. So I think as the springtime comes up, I'm going to fertilize it a little bit more again, but this is a very thick stem and fairly succulent in nature, so I don't want to overwater it. In some cases, people would be like, oh, I want to actually water that Peperomia. But in many cases, Peperomia react kind of opposite to most houseplants. They'll actually wilt if you give them too much water, strangely enough. So we're going to be moving a little bit over to the right here. I know I skipped some of these, like Peperomia viridis, Variegata. Very easy one to grow and also fairly common. You can find this around in garden centers if you're lucky. And then over here, these are like the slightly less, I would say, succulent varieties, even though this Peperomia polybotrya is a bit more succulent, I find to be a very resilient plant to grow. And you can see is quite tall. It kind of reminds me, this peltate leaf reminds me very much of the argyreia one that I have here, the watermelon Peperomia. Very easy to take cuttings of this one as well. Peperomia blonda, which is one of the ones that I have flowering, is quite thin, but still pretty resilient. And then I have Peperomia jamesoniana here, and I have to laugh because I had a little Peperomia caperata in here, but the jamesoniana just like kind of engulfed the caperata. So I only have like a few leaves of the caperata left, and you can see it's just like spilling itself outside of this little terrarium that I planted it in. This is Peperomia cubensis. Cubensis means that it's discovered in Cuba. I don't know if it's endemic to Cuba, but it, or even if it's found in Cuba, but cubensis usually says that it's from Cuba. This is Peperomia Clover. I don't have a species name. I think it's a cultivar. And Peperomia rubella, which I think is actually native to Jamaica, I believe. It's a cute little one. I have it growing in several of my terrariums. And then this is a cultivar called Peperomia European trailing. Really nice green leaf. And the other one that I have growing right now temporarily in this terrarium, I had to take it out of my other terrarium to kind of show you, is my Peperomia ferreyrae, which is called flowering Peperomia. And this one has like the thinnest leaves, very finicky as a plant, and it also has succulent stems, but they're very frail. I find if you like hit them the wrong way, they actually easily break. So that one is a little bit more of a challenging Peperomia to grow. Oh, and I have another, favorite one that I had totally looked over. If you could come over here and take a look. Here, it has little red underneath. This is Peperomia verticillata, so same as the belly button Peperomia, but its cultivated name is red log. And I think that it probably just has this little red underside, which I think is so adorable. I actually got this from the Netherlands and brought it in. So I hope you enjoyed nerding out on all of this Peperomia, because I really do want to give you a sense of the breadth and diversity of this great genus of plants.
Check out the Peperomia Care video if you haven't yet, and let me know what peps were new for you and what ones you'll likely be adding to your collection in the comments below. If you're up for supporting more videos like this, then plant your cursor on that subscribe button and hit the notifications bell so you know when the next video drops. And stay tuned to more news on my blog at homesteadbrooklyn.com, follow my daily journey on Instagram at homesteadbrooklyn, and dive more deeply into houseplant cultivation and care at houseplantmasterclass.com.